Good morning everyone, welcome to our small footprint. My name is Nyssa, and if you're new here, we are a family of 8 who live off-grid in Australia. We're still on our current series of videos post my 6 weekly grocery shop. I try and do daily to every second day videos it takes me about a week to 2 weeks to cover it all, of how we use the food that we buy in a 6 weekly grocery haul living off-grid for 8 of us. So today's video I'm showing we got some tomatoes in bulk. So I'm showing you how I use the tomatoes over the last few days. If you haven't watched it, I roasted all the tomatoes off in pans in the barbecue because we don't have an oven. I use the barbecue, and then I put them aside to use for pasta sauce. So today I'm turning those tomatoes that I had roasted into pasta sauce and roasted tomato soup as well. I also made some brownie with a few little hiccups, so I shared that as well because it's always fun to share the fails as well. And I think that was it for today. So enjoy watching, and I will see you again tomorrow or the next day. And thank you so much for watching. Bye guys. So it's completely optional, but I like to caramelize my onions for a lot of my pasta sauces and things like that. I just really like the flavor of it. So what I started off doing was I diced all my onions to cook them. So you could put them in raw, you could just fry them off in the bottom of the pan, but caramelizing them just adds that extra flavor, and I have the time, so I did it. So I have this dicer from Vivor. I'll try and remember to put a link in the comments. You can buy them in a variety of different places though. It's just like a commercial kitchen type tool. And I bought the one with just one static plate because that dice size plate was great. I would probably suggest buying the ones that has interchangeable plates, because then you could remove the plates to clean them. This one the plate doesn't remove, so cleaning is a little bit more challenging, but it works really well anyway. So I had one of the small plastic ones, you know, the plastic ones with the lid that lifts up and pops down, but I tend to break the blades off in the grid all the time on it. So I still have one of those that I use for jalapenos for cowboy candy, but I find anything larger I struggle and I'm too worried about breaking it. So I bought one of these stainless steel ones. Anyway, Kavik wanted to help, and that's fine. He was trying to help me dice the onions. I tend to slice the onions into rings, I suppose, before I dice them, because it's easier to get them through the grid, but also because if you do larger pieces of onion, then you're going to get more strips or chip-like pieces than little cubes. So I sliced them and was placing them onto the plate for him to pull down, but it does require a little bit of leverage to be able to get it through the onions, unless you've got some force behind you, and he's at the wrong height. We had this issue with Sonnet juicing something. She wanted to help, and the bench is just that little bit too high even when they're up on a stool. I think when I eventually redo my kitchen that I might have a slightly lower bench that I can put a couple of these appliances on, so that when they want to help with that sort of thing, I can move the appliance to that lower bench so that they're standing over it like an adult does over the standard size bench, and then maybe they'll have a better point to be able to do it, because this is how easy it is for me to do it. You build up a bit of a rhythm and you just place the rings on the thing and slide it. I use one hand to hold the handle up because the handle automatically falls down, and the other hand to place and crank, and it's really quick. It didn't come with a container to go underneath it, and the size between the legs is a little awkward, but regardless of all the negatives, it's definitely a great tool to have for the kitchen. So once you've diced your onions, and when I caramelize onions, I tend to do an entire pot's worth at a time because it just seems to be worthwhile. When I make my caramelized onions for canning, or the caramelized onion jam, I tend to have 2 or 3 pots going, because by the time they're all caramelized, it's only 1 pot worth. So when they cook down a lot. So I fill a whole pot with the onions, add a little bit of fat. I used a bit of ghee. You could use anything you want, and realistically you could avoid adding it if you wanted to. You just have to be careful to move the onions around so that they don't burn until they release some of that liquid. If you salt your onions, that it will make them release a bit more liquid quickly to cook off too, which will help. So you can add a bit of salt to the onions as well when you're caramelizing them. The next thing I did was I decided to make chocolate brownie. I felt like something chocolatey. The recipe on the back of the plant-based condensed milk has been recommended a few times, so I have attempted it once and it was a flop. So I thought, well, that must have just been me. I will make it again. So I used the Thermomix to make it because you have to melt chocolate and things like that, and I don't have a microwave. So I used the basic method that is used for brownie type dishes in a Thermomix, and so I mixed all the dry ingredients together and then put them aside, and then I put the chocolate chips and the oil into the Thermomix to melt, and then I turned it on and melted it all. Then add the rest of the wet, like the eggs and things like that, and mixed that together, and then added the dry back in, mixed that in, and then folded anything mixed in. So we used walnuts in this particular one because that's what I'm using at the moment. I have said before I managed to get some short dated walnuts cheap from Honest to Goodness, so that's what I'm using through at the moment. Now, I had forgotten when I started making the brownies that my square brownie pan had been broken recently. Because we cook on the barbecue on the side that has open grill, you can't put anything ceramic over that side because the heat is too direct, it will crack. Darryl wasn't aware of that, and he put the brownie pan on that side of the oven and it cracked in half, so I don't have a brownie pan at the moment. I am going to try and find a relevant sized cast iron one because I'm trying to replace everything with cast iron as I go so that I don't have that worry about open flame. But I had forgotten when I started making this brownie. So I pulled out a small ceramic dish and was filling it and going, I think this might be a bit too much batter, but brownies don't rise very much. So I thought, I'll give it a go. The next size up pan that I have is quite significant. I think it's too much batter to split between two, all that sort of discussion that goes on in your head when you're trying to do something and you're sitting there trying to talk yourself into giving it a go and thinking this is probably a really bad idea. Well, it was a little bit of a bad idea. So as soon as the brownie started cooking, it did lift. So this particular recipe obviously has quite a lot of lift before it falls, because that's how brownies end up with that cracking on top, is they do have a bit of lift before a fall. Obviously this one lifts quite a lot, so it all overflowed. I quickly put a baking tray underneath it so that the overflowing chocolate didn't land in the flames of or on the cast iron plates of the barbecue because that was smelly, and let it go. Just thought, well, I'll just cook it, and even if we have to cut only the middle out to eat it, then that's life. And the kids have eaten all the non-burnt bits and enjoyed it. So, I don't think I'm a huge fan of the recipe. It's very, very sweet. There's a lot of sugar in it. Like there's added sugar plus the condensed milk plus the chocolate chips. But I think I can adapt it and remove the added sugar and things like that. So I'm going to give it another go in a better pan at another time. So the next thing was starting on the pasta sauce for the canning. So I've had those onions caramelizing because that was the first step, started them early, and now I have to do everything else. So pasta sauce. When you are making something that's water bathed tomato based, there is a certain amount of other vegetables that you can add before it's going to affect the acidity too much to be viable for water bath canning. Now there's lots of charts. I'll try and find a chart and put a listing up, but there's I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it is something along the lines of 1 cup of fresh onion to, I want to say 6 cups maybe of fresh tomatoes is like the maximum amount of onion that you want to add. Things like capsicum and that also and mushrooms they bring the acidity right down. So the ratios that I've used here I'm comfortable with for water bath canning via looking at charts and deciding what I'm going to use. But if you want to make a pasta sauce and you don't want to have to worry about how much you're putting in and the ratios and things like that, you can always pressure can it. So if you just want to make it so it tastes exactly how you want it, then you just pressure can the sauce instead of water bath canning it. Really isn't that much difference in timing either, to be honest. There's the time, well, not even, because the water takes a while to boil anyway, and I probably should have just pressure canned these regardless because it would have used a whole lot less water than water bath canning them, but I didn't. I did the ratios in a way that I'm comfortable with. So I used some carrot, celery, zucchini, the caramelized onion, a bit of garlic, and then a whole lot of tomatoes. I cooked all the vegetables off first, so I sweated off all the celery and all the rest of it, and my zucchini was frozen, so I sweated all that off and got some of the liquid off, and then I added all the tomatoes. So these are all the tomatoes that I've roasted over the last few days. I ended up with 3 of the containers that are about 4.5 litres and another big bowl that's a couple of litres. I don't know the exact literage here. I went with underestimating when I was looking at the other ingredients rather than overestimating. Because these are, they're not homegrown, they're commercially grown, but homegrown tomatoes, the acidity can't be relied on for them either, not like canned tomato sauce and canned diced tomatoes and things like that. So I put that all in and cooked it down a little bit. Again, if you don't want to follow a specific recipe, just pressure can it. I'm just going to put that out there. Once that was all heated up, I did add a jar of tomato paste. Now, tomato paste is completely optional. You don't have to add tomato paste, but it does thicken the sauce up fairly quickly. So you can cook it down and it'll thicken up, but by adding that tomato paste, it reduces the cooking down time. And my thing here is that we don't use this on its own. We use this pasta sauce with bolognese. This is because my bolognese has pearl barley and stuff in it, so by the time it's cooked, cooled, frozen, defrosted, it's really thick and it's not very wet. And then I'm serving it to 6 to 8 people. So we add a jar of this pasta sauce to the bolognese to stretch it. So I don't need it to be particularly thick, but I do add a jar of tomato paste to help with it a little bit. You can add any seasonings that you want here to a degree if you're water bath canning it, but pretty much anything you want if you're going to pressure can it. I use some Worcestershire sauce, which doesn't really affect the acidity. Balsamic vinegar, which if anything is going to lift the acidity, so that's fine. I used some smoked paprika, a bit of salt and pepper, and I think I added a couple of tablespoons of sugar once I tasted it. It just needed something to mellow that acidity out a little bit in flavour there. Sugar alters the flavour. Sometimes you'll taste it and it just feels too light, and then you add a little bit of sugar, mix it up, and you taste it, and all of a sudden there's this depth to the sauce that it didn't have before. I sometimes add powdered dehydrated mushrooms. I didn't this time because I was water bath canning it. If I was pressure canning it, I would have. And then you cook it down. So with tomatoes, and especially the way I did it, because you saw me putting the pans of tomatoes into the Thermomix before I did this, I kept all the water. So when I poured it out of the pans, I kept all the tomato water. I didn't leave it behind, which means that there's a fair bit of water in this sauce. So the more you cook it down, the better it'll sit in the jars. It's a little bit of personal preference here too. Thickness, quantity, whatever you want. I was happy to leave a bit more water in it to allow for more quantity because of the way we use it. So I just let it cook down for a while. During that time, I also made the roasted tomato soup for dinner. So I had that container of roasted tomatoes that I had peeled, and these went into the rest of the caramelized onions, and then cooked down, and then I added about 2 litres of chicken stock to it as well, and then tasted it, added seasoning. So I think I added a little bit of sugar, some Worcestershire, probably some paprika, salt, pepper, maybe some balsamic, anything like that that needed to change the flavour, and just cooked that and put it aside for dinner. Once the pasta sauce was where I was comfortable with, or I think I ran out of time mostly, I did puree it again in my Thermomix because it had all those veggies in it. You don't have to, and by pureeing it and putting it straight in the jars, I am introducing a bit of air to those jars. Ideally you want to puree it and then cook it off for 5 minutes so that the air can push through back up through the sauce, but I wasn't overly concerned. I debubbled and it is what it is. So I pureed it and then filled the jars. I used Fowler's 27s, which are about 600 mils, and I just filled them to where the neck starts to narrow. I find that that's a good spot to fill to with those. I ended up with 21 jars of sauce, which is awesome, out of those tomatoes. So they were the 2 cartons of tomato romas that I bought from the fruit and veg shop at $10 a carton, and then some of the slicing tomatoes that I got from the hamper as well. You have to clean the rims of the jars with white vinegar like normal. Fowler's jars, you're cleaning the outside rim, not the top. I didn't get a great angle on this, but I have shown it a few times. Then you place the rubber rings in that little slot, and I always wipe the rings with white vinegar as well because I've used my hands to place the rings on there. Some people put the rings on before they fill the jars. I find it easier to do it this way. Once I wiped the rings again, then you place the stainless steel lids on and the clips to hold the lids on. We water bath this for I think I did it for 25 minutes because it's above a pint, under a quart, and some mixed ingredients at an altitude that's over 1,000 feet. But there is charts to look at for that. There was a spare jar. I could only fit 20 jars in the canner, 12 in my big buffalo canner and 8 in my Presto. So a spare jar went into the fridge for dinner for tomorrow night, and we will mix that with one of the 1.2 kilo bags of bolognese that's already in the freezer, and they will have that for dinner. And then if there's any leftovers, they have it for lunch the next day. So I hope I covered everything there. Feel free to ask any questions. It wasn't a very in-depth canning video, this one, but it gives you a rundown, and I will see you again tomorrow. Thanks, guys.